And it is going. Takes a sec for Zoom to connect. We actually might even be live right now. It just won't tell me first that. Seeing if I see myself on the page. All right, we are live. So I'm really, really excited for this Facebook Live. I have Lena Papadopoulosa with me right now. She is not only a traveler, but an intercultural consultant, and she has so much good wisdom to share. She's just going to be telling us how to travel more ethically, make deeper connections with locals when traveling, have truly transformative experiences while traveling versus, just kind of seeing the sights. Traveling in a way that leads to a more inclusive world, and really, really good stuff. And what I love about her advice is it's very no fluff and very actionable. So on that note, why don't we start with you just telling us a little bit more about yourself. And while Lena is talking, I'm just going to pop a link in the chat to her own website, just so everyone can kind of check out what she does as well.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Lena, and I am actually now on this live from my grandmother's house in Greece. So I am in the little small village in northern Greece where my parents are both from, and they immigrated to the US when they were younger, and I was born shortly after my mom got there. My dad had been there a bit longer. And yeah, I kind of grew up between South Carolina in the United States and this little village in Greece. And that really played a big role, I think, in shaping the way that I saw the world, that I perceived myself, because I was kind of between these two like very different cultures where I was never really enough of anything in either one. And it also gave me this very interesting like perspective of how differently people think and behave and operate. And this was really sort of the beginning of my interest in intercultural things. And then I went on to university and got involved in something called a cultural exchange community. And I was living in a complex designed to foster relationships between international students and domestic students. And that like had a really significant impact on me. And from there, I went on to get a master's in cultural anthropology and started this career in intercultural education. So yeah, that's a bit of my background.
I love it. And I'm just curious, what was it called? A cultural exchange community?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Was that something you were able to be a part of through your school, like a study abroad type thing? Or is there like another website or another organization you go through for something like that?
It was based at my university. So it was like we had all of our student housing, but there was one apartment complex dedicated to this specifically. So you could just sign up to be a part of it. It had nothing to do with study abroad or anything like that.
Okay.
So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, I wish I knew about that.
Oh yeah, it's really cool. And I think really unique. There aren't really that many things like that in American universities. There are some other ones like, but not too many.
Yeah. So you touched on how you had that unique experience of growing up as a Greek American, kind of split between these two cultures. Mm-hmm. What was that like, and how did it shape you as a person? I know you touched on that, but was there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, it just really, it made me more aware of how we are conditioned to think and behave in certain ways, because I could just see this hugely vast difference between these two cultures I was a part of and belonged to. And so I think it really, like, it made me question a lot of stuff and question what is true and what is real. And yeah, just like understanding how we have been shaped by conditioning and programming in a sense. I mean, I had more context for understanding what that all even meant in these kinds of terms much later, but just having that experience between the US and Greece like opened my eyes to that.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I feel like people might kind of like take notice that it exists or it might cross their mind, but to be able to like dig deeper in the way that you have is so interesting. And I feel like I wouldn't even know where to begin on like how to kind of like uncover all of these things. Like what was kind of
Hmm.
the first step for you with that?
Hmm. Oh, yeah. I mean, it is kind of complex, especially because so much of this is hidden from our awareness. I mean,
Is it like
I
a mindset that you kind of get into and to, yeah, like dig deeper?
oh gosh, I don't. It's hard to say that there's like anything specific that I did because it was just about this exposure and like because through neuroscience, like our brains are very susceptible to our environment. They're plastic, so they're literally being molded by our environment. And so the way that Americans' brains are shaped and molded is impacted by their cultural values, and the way Greeks the same. So I was kind of like having both of them mold and shape me at the same time. So it's interesting because you have like a lot of people that will come to Greece and make observations and say, oh, like Greek culture is like this or Greek people are like this, and me, from my perspective, I'm like, no, like that's so not true, because you can't understand all the nuance that you see and understand when you've grown up here. And there's also a role that language plays, and it's like I, in a lot of ways, almost take on like different traits and characteristics when I speak Greek versus when I speak English. So it's like we're so shaped by it in so many hidden ways. And when I was in graduate school in cultural anthropology, I was what we call a halfie, um, because yeah, because my research focused on Greek culture and like Greek religious nationalism. And so halfies are people who are insiders in both, like they are insiders in the culture that they study, but they're also outsiders of it, so they come to it from another perspective. So in that way, we're thought to kind of have a special understanding of what we study, because we can see and acknowledge the things that are taken for granted within a culture, things that we are just so normalized as an outsider, but we also understand things from an insider perspective that an outsider wouldn't understand through observation. So it's like a very unique positionality.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I love that you touched on like how people can go to a place and say like, "Oh, a culture is like this" when they've been there like 2 days. I see that a
Mm-hmm.
lot. Even
Mm-hmm.
like about like New York City type of like the culture of New York City. I
Mm-hmm.
see posts all the time that I'm like, you're definitely not from here and you definitely have
Right.
no here.
Mm-hmm.
So we mentioned the term intercultural learning. So
Mm-hmm.
before we dive deeper into that, can you just provide a definition for people who maybe are a little bit unclear of what that means?
Yes. So it is the process of developing the skills to engage both effectively and appropriately across cultures. So it's like doing a whole set of different things, like learning interculturally to be able to develop those skills.
Awesome. And so, as you explained to me, intercultural learning is a great tool for maximizing the transformative power of travel. So, maybe can you share a personal example?
Mhm. Um, yes. So, yeah, we, as I did say to you, we tend to think of travel as like this inherently transformational experience. I'm going to go there and it's going to change my life, or I did this and it changed me. And sometimes we think we're changed, we're not actually changed. Maybe some aspect of the way that we see things, or maybe something within us healed because of an experience that we had. But I think that travel is transformational depending on how and why you travel. So I have definitely seen a lot of people spend significant time abroad and they regress in their intercultural competency, and that can happen for like a whole variety of reasons. Or or people use sort of the difference and the unfamiliar that they see to reinforce their unconscious bias or prejudice toward people. So like, oh, they do that. Like I knew those people were lazy, and they just create this sort of blanket understanding of people based on an assumption that they've made or an observation that they've made. And so I think that for travel to really be transformative, to be changed by travel in a true way, like to have your heart and mind opened, you have to really be open to seeking to understand other perspectives and meet people where they're at and not where you think they should be at or what you
Yeah.
assume about them. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting too, because like we were talking about a bit, I think a lot of people go away and they're like, oh, this is going to change me. Or they read Eat, Pray, Love and they go to India and they're like, oh, I'm going to be such a different person.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe they don't even really interact with locals.
Right.
I mean, maybe they're taking like a taxi or something, but
Mm-hmm.
they're not really connecting with people. And then they come back like, oh, that wasn't what I thought it would be.
Mm-hmm.
But they go thinking simply like getting on that plane is what's going to be transformative. And that's not always the
Right.
case.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, for travelers who haven't had many intercultural learning experiences, where would they start their research to find these?
Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of things you can do to sort of engage in intercultural learning, and you definitely don't have to travel. So if you feel limited in some way by finances or whatever, it's not necessary to go to another country to engage in intercultural learning. And for me, the most important part always is to develop more self-awareness around who you are, what you value, how that has been shaped by your cultural context. Um, I'm really a big fan of personality assessments. I always recommend that people do them just to have like a better understanding of how and why do I operate the way I do. Um, and then I also have like a workbook on my website where that's more geared specifically toward understanding how you've been shaped by culture specifically. Of course, you can read books, you can watch movies like foreign films, seek out different news outlets from around the world, not just ones that are based in your home country, just to be exposed to different perspectives. It's really interesting to see how differently different places share news.
Even in the US, I feel like each channel shares it so like the same story.
Yeah.
You're like, that's the same story. It's just like a totally different headline.
Right.
Altogether.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Um, Something as simple as like exposing yourself to different environments. So say you're a person of habit and routine and you always kind of do the same thing, which is something that I tend to get stuck in because as much as I love novelty, I like kind of knowing what's happening and what to expect. But this, like being in that kind of routine, can actually hinder our ability to engage effectively cross-culturally, because the more that we expose ourselves to anything that is unfamiliar to us, the more we're able to build resilience and kind of be able to deal with things that are like unexpected. But if we always stay in a constant routine and we're never put in a position to have to like face something that wasn't planned or is unfamiliar, it can be super jarring and overwhelming for us when that happens. So engaging in cultural difference can be jarring and overwhelming if we don't have the resilience to deal with it. And then of course there are like really formal ways to engage in intercultural learning, like online courses or courses in school, which I think anybody who travels at all or engages with cultural difference, which I think most of us do, even if we're not really super aware of it. I think everybody should take a course on intercultural communication and understanding the way that different cultures operate. And there's a really great online course on Future Learn. It's a website that offers online courses And I linked it in the written part that I did for you that you will share later.
Yeah, I'm going to be sharing a big blog post with all this, but also once this Facebook Live ends, I'll put all the links in the comments too if people want them right away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love that. Like, I wonder, could it even be as simple as like every week you eat the same exact thing every single day, and then like you buy like some cookbook and you try some new things
Yeah.
to kind of like get out of your routine.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And if there are places around where you can go eat food from some other place that isn't like your home country or culture, like anything you do really that exposes you to the unfamiliar and allows you to engage with difference in a way that makes you more receptive to it.
I love that. So, how can travelers ensure they're engaging with cultural communities in respectful, mutually beneficial ways when they're actually traveling? Or maybe even at home when they're kind of, used to other cultures?
Yeah. So I think that one of our biggest hangups when it comes to engaging with different people from other parts of the world is that we treat culture as a thing, and this is a very, let's say, Western way of thinking. So we have highly individualistic societies, which put the individual above community or the collective, and there's a focus on individual success, individual accomplishment, and so places like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, much of Europe, they fall into this. They're individualistic societies. They're also what we call low context cultures, which means that information is readily available and accessible. Rules are sort of expected to be followed. It's like everything's kind of, there's a lot of structure.
Yeah.
So in countries or people, I guess, who come from individualist and low context cultures, we have a tendency to objectify concepts. We think of concepts as things. Culture is one of them. So I'll give another example that I think maybe might help people understand it a little better. But another one of those is time is a concept that we treat as an object. We talk about time as money. My time can be wasted. Your time can be disrespected. It's like this thing, and we view it as something very linear. Whereas people from collectivist cultures, high context cultures, where context is really important, the why and how of something is a lot more important than the what of it, as in low context culture. So those cultures, they view time not as a linear thing, but as a circular thing. And we have a tendency in individualist cultures to to view time as a linear thing, that like monochronic, we call it. And collectivist cultures view time as polychronic. It's a force outside of our control. We have no say over what happens to us within a span of time. This is why like people from the Middle East say inshallah. They don't make commitments. They say inshallah, God willing, because I don't know what can happen in this amount of time. Time is a moving thing. I'm in a meeting. I can do multiple things at once because time is polychronic. We're talking about this thing on our agenda, but I'm answering a phone call. And these are the kinds of things that create cultural clashes. But because people from collectivist cultures, they don't view time as a thing. They view it as a concept. But we from individualistic cultures, we view time as a thing. And we do the same with a lot of concepts, and culture is one of them. So because we view culture as a thing, we perceive it as something that we can understand, that we can sort of wrap our minds around, that it's something we experience. It's something I'm going to go, like, I know this culture, I get to know this culture. And what happens when we do that is that we essentially tokenize the people within the culture, because we see it as this thing, and so the people who belong to it represent this thing, and we almost treat them like cultural artifacts. And that's why we might not think anything of taking a picture of somebody, because to us, oh, that person is a representation of this culture that I'm experiencing, rather than as like a human being with a life. We don't, it's like, because of how our mind is processing what we're observing, we're objectifying everything around us. And I think this is the root of where so much of the maybe disrespectful behavior comes from abroad. And even maybe people who perceive themselves to be really respectful still engage in disrespectful behaviors unconsciously, because of how they're perceiving what they're experiencing.
Yeah, when you were telling me about the objectifying culture concept, that was such, I've never heard it put that way, but I was like, it was kind of like mind blown, like, wow, that is so true. And especially with the pictures, like, I've definitely become more conscious of it over the years, like of like now always asking if I could take a photo. I've definitely seen people get like really in people's faces and just like take a picture without asking, or taking pictures of children.
Yeah.
But I love the way you put that, because it's just like I've never thought of it in that way, like objectifying a culture. I've always just thought of it as like, umbrella ethical tourism. But yeah, I think that's like a really good way to put it, to even make it easier to kind of understand. Yeah. So in terms of like being respectful and ethical, how can travelers take their interactions with locals to a deeper level in a natural, comfortable way while, still being respectful?
Yeah, so I think this has a lot to do with how we engage with people. So again, like not treating people as objects or representatives of a culture, but as individuals with their own lived experiences, because everybody's story is so different, and like one person does not represent a whole country or culture or group of people. And that's what we do a lot when we travel and we try to understand culture, is we just like, oh, I met this one person and they did this thing, so I think this about people from that place. And like, obviously that's problematic. So yeah, I think it's really about being present with people and trying to understand their perspective the way that they want to share it. So I think a lot of us, what we perceive to be empathy is not really empathy. So, and I will say this for myself too, that for almost all of my life, I thought like, oh, I'm such an empathetic person, I'm so good at empathy, because I thought of empathy as this thing that it's like, I try to understand what someone's going through because I imagine what it would be like for me to go through that. But that's actually not empathy. It's not understanding how would that feel like for me. It's understanding how does it feel like for that person in their position, and the perspective that they have, and the background and environment that they come from. And a lot of times we actually don't even have the context for true empathy, because especially engaging in cultural difference, because the way that I am going to feel and respond to a situation in my life is very shaped by my culture, by my upbringing, by my environment. The way I perceive something's impact on me is shaped by that. So somebody who comes from a different cultural context and environment, the way that they feel and perceive an event or situation might be completely different, because again, like literally the way that their brain works is different. So it's like we just can't necessarily assume that we understand someone's experience because we imagine what it would be like if we were to have that experience. And so when we try to get to know somebody from that perspective of like, oh, this is how I would feel, and we say, did you feel XYZ, based on our own assumptions of what it would be like to have a certain kind of experience, then we're projecting our own beliefs and values onto other people. So rather than say, was it, rather than ask questions in that way or make statements in that way, it's just asking somebody, what was that like for you?
Mm-hmm.
What did that feel like for you? Rather than, did you feel XYZ, or it must have been like this or like this based on what I assume I would feel in that situation. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, yeah, a lot of people, it's almost like I feel like it's, you hear so much like, oh, that must have been so hard or so sad. Cause yeah, I guess I'm thinking of it with myself, like,
Mm-hmm.
because you're thinking of how that would be for you. That makes so much sense. But it's like, it's nice to have these sort of like alternative phrases that you can use, like just a simple tweak and like how you would ask a question could make such a difference in how you connect with people and empathize with them. I love that. So, how do you recommend travelers handle situations when they find themselves interacting with a local who expresses cultural beliefs that maybe they morally oppose?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I think when we come to questions of what is or is not moral, we have a lot of conviction tied to that. There's a lot of emotion involved in how we define that for ourselves. And I think coming from that place it can really lead to conflict, because when we approach situations from that perspective, one, we become really attached to our convictions and to our point of view, and it becomes much harder to hear and understand someone else's point of view. So I think, again, rather than sort of projecting our own assumptions and values onto people, like, we may think something is morally wrong, but I think the approach is to understand from their perspective why they believe that, or what role it plays in their life. So many times, like, the things that we judge as, say, like, again, travelers from Western countries, so many of the things we judge are actually a result of colonialism and our influence in those places, and the ways that we disrupted ways of life, and how that led to so many other developments, and mixing of different religious ideals. Like, it's just so complex, because, again, when we see culture as this object, then we remove history from it. We remove the movement of people. We remove like the influence of religion and how it plays a role in mixing in with politics, or history, because religion looks very different in different places, and there's a reason for that. So it's really not our place to judge, because I guarantee you that there are so many people in other parts of the world that look at the things that we do and believe and are like, that is so immoral, that is so backwards. Like, it's just, but for us, it's so normal. We just think that's the way it is, and because that's the way it is, we perceive it as being right. And I do understand that there are some things that happen around the world that we might consider human rights violations, but then we also have to look at, like, who is defining what human rights even are. So it's complex, but I think that we never really can come to a place of bridge building if we want to say, well, like, that's not what we do or believe, that is, like, so wrong, and to put our own values on other people. So I think it's about creating space for understanding. So maybe you can still share your perspective, but not in a way that says, like, oh, I think your way is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the way that in my culture we, like, these are the thoughts we have around that. Like, what do you think about that? And create space for dialogue rather than feel the need to like tell people that they're wrong or teach them about what is right, which can also be very problematic, our mindset of needing to teach people in other parts of the world. So yeah.
Yeah. I was reading on Facebook, one of my friends was traveling somewhere and she was like talking to a guy at a bar, and he was talking about like how in their culture, I honestly forget exactly where she was, it was okay for men to get divorced and not women. I know, I'm from New York City, like to me that is tough to hear. But she was like, I was really interested in learning more about that, so instead of like saying what she thought, she just kind of like nodded along so she could keep him talking, because she's like, if I would have said what I felt or kind of like shamed him, then he probably would have just walked away from me or something. So for her, it ended up being kind of like educational in a way, like a little bit more insight into the place and the people.
Right.
That was interesting.
Yeah.
Are there any common mistakes you see travelers make when interacting with other cultures?
Yeah, so I think that, again, it is this tendency to treat culture as an object, because it is so far outside of our awareness that we even do that. Like we really just don't even realize that we're doing that, and that builds on so many other problematic sort of mindsets and behaviors that again are typically unconscious. So yeah, I think we really have to really understand that culture is super complex and nuanced, and no, like you're not going to understand it in 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. Like you could spend half your life, like say 30 years in a place, and you'll probably admit at that point that you know less about it than you thought you did in your first year, because you're consistently being exposed to how complex it is and how nuanced it is. And you can't see that when you're treating culture as an object, as an ahistorical thing without any context. So yeah, and then like I mentioned before, it's also this attitude of trying to help people, because again, our desire to help people is very much based on what we believe is right, which is not always right for somebody else. And this is why international development projects are largely like failures, because people just want to sort of say, okay, this is the way we do things, and here is like the fastest, most time efficient way to initiate a project. It's going to cost us the least amount of money. So I take something, an initiative that was successful in Rwanda, and I try to implement it in Malaysia. Like it's not going to work, because the context isn't there, and like you have to understand so much about a place to understand what will work there. And again, that understanding needs to come from people themselves, and people who live there need to decide, like, this is what we need, and this is why we need it, and this is how it's going to work best. Because so often we are making decisions about people without people, and that is colonial to its core. Like that's really not useful or helpful at all, and ends up, any investment is made in that, it usually ends up being a big waste of money, and also disrupting people's way of life that then lead to all of these sort of things that we later on look at and say like, oh, that's so backward, or that's so inefficient, or that's so whatever. And well, it's the product of the people who came before you, right? So it's
Yeah. And going off of what you were saying about the like putting projects in other places, I remember years ago, you might have even heard about this with the Tom shoes, how they were doing the give a pair, don't buy a pair, give a pair. And then they were like inadvertently putting local shoemakers out of business. And I think then they've like changed the model to do it better. But I feel like that's an example of just like, this sounds like something that would really be nice and great for people. And then has this like very negative effect.
Right.
So just one last question for you. In your opinion, What is the biggest challenge that travelers face when it comes to intercultural learning, and how can they overcome it?
Mm-hmm. Um, so I think it's really about the lack of self-awareness and the like our own blind spots and our inability to see how we've been shaped by our own cultural context. Because as long as we remain unaware of that, it doesn't matter really how eager we are to learn or like how much we pursue opportunities to engage in culture, like in cultural difference in meaningful and appropriate ways. We are still always going to be projecting our own attitudes, assumptions, values, biases, because we can't help but do that unless we are aware of them. Because again, it's operating like it's so outside of our awareness, our understanding. And so I really think, and I mean, this is a thing that is a problem kind of in all areas. I think not just when it comes to travel or going abroad, people's lack of self-awareness. And part of that is because we're just constantly distracting ourselves with a million other things. We're never present with ourselves. We're never reflecting on things. I mean, some people do, of course.
Probably more true now than ever with like Instagram and
yes.
all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like all of our free time is filled with something. Like we have to have something in our hands. We have to look at something. Or we'll be bored otherwise. God forbid we like spend time thinking.
Just like sit in silence with no gadget in your hand.
Yeah. So yeah, I really think it's this lack of self-awareness and understanding how you have been shaped by your culture. Because even the stories that we tell about ourselves and our lives, they are products of culture. So you ask an American, like, what's your life story? And probably everybody's going to answer with something that focuses around the degrees that they got, the jobs that they've had. It's all about personal accomplishment, individual success, like the American dream, right? But you ask somebody from China what their life story is, and it's going to revolve around people, relationships, births, deaths. It's a different story because of how culture has impacted and influenced and shaped us. So it's really in every part of our lives that we just don't really see it. We're not aware of it. And I think that is the biggest challenge, is all of the things beyond our awareness.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like a step towards becoming more aware is maybe like putting the phones and gadgets away and sitting in silence, like with a notebook or, nothing at all, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, I really think we need to prioritize spending time with ourselves. And that doesn't just mean like I'm alone, so I'm spending time with myself. Like if
watching
I'm
Netflix by yourself.
right. Yeah. It's just being intentional about being with yourself, and reflecting on like, oh, well, what was that situation that happened? So there's something that I use sometimes in my work. It's called ABCs. Record your ABCs. So to become more aware of how we have been impacted and influenced by our experiences, and how we then project that onto future experiences. Like A is the activating event. So like, what was the thing that happened, the situation? B is the belief. What did you come to believe because of that event? And then what is the consequence of that? So how does that continue to impact you today? How does it play a role in the relationships that you create, in the way that you think about yourself, in the way that you perceive the world? And so I use this with people regarding intercultural experiences that they've had, to maybe become more aware of how and why they might have formed certain stereotypes about people through a kind of engagement that they had that maybe left kind of a negative impact on them. So yeah, I mean, I just think taking the time to reflect on all of this, like, like what is it that I think about that, and why? The why is so important. And I don't think that we really spend a lot of time thinking about the why
Yeah.
of us and what we think.
I'm wondering too, I know I said last question, but just because of what you were just saying, I wonder if people have a hard time. I know I have a hard time with this kind of thing. Like if something comes up where maybe like they realize like they said the wrong thing or did the wrong thing, do you find that maybe that's like hard for people to admit to themselves sometimes?
Yes, very much so. Actually, when I mentioned before that a lot of people regress in their intercultural competency, it's around their fear. It's often around their fear of doing or saying the wrong thing and not wanting have to face the consequences of that. Um, so yeah, I definitely think that it's a struggle for people, especially because um, I think that we tend to avoid like anything that makes us uncomfortable. And when we are triggered by certain things, for example, rather than deal with that, we try to avoid it, which means it never goes away. Like
Yeah.
if you don't face it, it will always be there. So um,
When you could
yeah,
like
I mean,
learn from it for next time, uh,
yeah.
versus like, yeah, totally. I feel
Hmm.
like when it's, especially, it's not like, oh, I forgot to like pick up milk on the way home. It's like, oh, I like may have offended someone. I feel like that would be a little harder.
Right. And also because
See the
when you
benefit.
make when you make a mistake like that, then your acceptance is threatened, right? Or like the idea that somebody else will accept you, you fear no longer belonging, which means you fear no longer being worthy, which this all ties into identity too, the way that we identify and identify others. God, there's a lot to say,
Yeah,
but
it's like
yeah,
a
like
big topic.
yes, but yeah, so much of I think our fears are just centered around not belonging and not being accepted by other people. That's why we don't want to admit to those kinds of mistakes either.
Yeah. Wow. This was all amazing. I'm so excited that you shared all of this. And like I said, I'm going to be, for everyone watching or watching later, I'm going to be putting this into a longer blog post with a written version as well. So you'll get all this information again. Before we end this, why don't you just tell everyone where they can find you online? I put a link to your website in the comments, but maybe on social media.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, my website and my Facebook and my Instagram and my LinkedIn are all Lena Papadopoulos, my name. So as long as they can see it there written and see how it's spelled, you can find me. Yeah.
Perfect. And then when we end, I'm just going to pop on Facebook and put the links to the personality test, your workbook, and the free course you
The
mentioned.
course. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This was amazing.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
To find the end button now.
Yeah. Also, like, I don't know. How do I get off? Okay.
I know I have to. Oh, Zoom. Oh, Zoom. Okay.
Okay.
All
I think I know. Okay. Bye.
right. Bye. Oh, here we go. Yep.